During the Cold War, intelligence reports were rarely feared. They were challenged, disputed, reinterpreted, or ignored. Fear usually came from actions, not documents. But there were rare exceptions, moments when a report itself became a threat. One such moment began when the CIA obtained indirect access to a classified KGB analytical report in the late 1970s. The document did not describe a new weapon, a military buildup, or a covert operation. Instead, it analyzed the United States itself, its political behavior, its intelligence culture, its internal decision-making logic, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. According to fragments later reconstructed by American analysts, the KGB report argued that U.S. intelligence was becoming increasingly vulnerable, not because of Soviet action, but because of its own assumptions. The report suggested that American analysts were overconfident in their predictive models and underestimated how fear accelerated misinterpretation. This assessment struck a nerve. The CIA was accustomed to being analyzed, but rarely in this way. The KGB report did not accuse. It did not exaggerate. It observed. It treated American intelligence not as an adversary to be confronted, but as a system to be understood and, if necessary, indirectly influenced. The report allegedly outlined scenarios in which U.S. intelligence could misread routine, Soviet behavior as hostile escalation. It emphasized how speed, political pressure, and institutional expectation could override caution. Most unsettling of all, it suggested that the United States might initiate irreversible decisions based on internal consensus rather than verified intent. When this assessment reached American intelligence circles through secondary channels, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some dismissed it as Soviet psychological warfare. Others believed it was exaggerated self-confidence on the KGB's part. But a smaller group saw something far more troubling. The report aligned too closely with internal debates already taking place inside the CIA. It echoed concerns that had never been formalized, never written down, and never shared outside closed rooms. The KGB had not uncovered secrets. It had uncovered patterns. That realization transformed the document from foreign analysis into a mirror. And mirrors were dangerous. They forced institutions to confront weaknesses they preferred to believe did not exist. Rather than respond publicly or challenge the report, the CIA chose silence. The document was classified at the highest level. Its circulation was restricted. References to it were removed from analytical summaries. Over time, the report became something else entirely, not a threat from the Soviet Union, but a risk to American confidence. Internally, discussions about the report were discouraged. It was not denied, it was simply avoided. Analysts who referenced it were reminded that foreign assessments were inherently biased, yet no official rebuttal was ever written. That absence was revealing. The CIA understood that acknowledging the report would legitimize its conclusions. Refuting it would require admitting that the questions it raised were valid. Ignoring it was safer. For decades, the report remained buried. It did not appear in declassified histories. It was not cited in Cold War retrospectives. Younger analysts never heard of it. The document existed in a liminal space, known to some, denied by none, and discussed by almost no one. What made the situation extraordinary was not that the KGB had written a critical analysis of the CIA. It was that the CIA recognized the analysis as potentially accurate. The fear was not exposure, it was recognition. And that fear would shape how the report was treated for the next 30 years. After the initial shock subsided, the CIA treated the KGB report not as hostile intelligence, but as a structural anomaly. Foreign services analyzed each other constantly, yet this document stood apart. It did not attempt to predict American actions. It examined how those actions were decided. That distinction made it difficult to counter. Internally, the report circulated within a narrowly defined analytical circle. Access was restricted not because it revealed Soviet secrets, but because it challenged American ones. The language of the document was calm, methodical, and almost clinical. There were no ideological attacks, no Cold War rhetoric. It read like an internal assessment written by someone who understood intelligence, culture from the inside. The report's central argument was unsettling. It suggested that U.S. intelligence assessments were being increasingly shaped by institutional momentum. Once a consensus formed, dissent became costly. Analysts who questioned dominant interpretations risked isolation or career stagnation. Over time, this dynamic narrowed the range of acceptable conclusions. This was not news to everyone. Similar concerns had been raised quietly within the CIA for years. But seeing them articulated so clearly by an external adversary forced an uncomfortable recognition. The KGB had identified vulnerabilities that American leadership preferred to treat as internal matters, not strategic weaknesses. Attempts were made to discredit the report analytically. Some argued that it exaggerated worst-case scenarios. Others claimed it underestimated American safeguards. Yet none of these critiques fully addressed the core issue. The report was not predicting failure. It was describing conditions under which failure became possible. That nuance made it resistant to dismissal. As a precaution, references to the report were removed from working papers. It was excluded from training materials and strategic discussions. Officially, it was categorized as foreign analysis of limited relevance. Unofficially, it was treated as a destabilizing influence. The CIA feared that if the report became widely known, it could undermine confidence in the analytical process itself. Intelligence depended not only on accuracy, but on belief. Analysts needed to trust the system that validated their conclusions. A foreign document suggesting that the system could mislead itself posed a threat to that trust. At the same time, the report could not be ignored entirely. Its conclusions echoed too closely with real-world incidents, moments when alerts escalated rapidly, cases where ambiguous signals were interpreted as intent, situations where speed overrode caution. Each time such an incident occurred, the report resurfaced quietly in internal memory. No official acknowledgement followed. There was no policy response. The CIA chose compartmentalization. The report was allowed to exist, but only in isolation. It became a reference without authority, a warning without attribution. This approach created a paradox. The more the report was suppressed, the more significant it became to those who knew of it. Silence amplified its weight. It transformed the document from analysis into taboo. Meanwhile, the KGB never publicized the report. It did not reference it in propaganda or diplomatic messaging. From the Soviet perspective, the report had already achieved its purpose. It had not been written to intimidate. It had been written to understand. That understanding, once obtained, required no further action. The CIA's fear was not that the KGB would exploit the report publicly. It was that American analysts might internalize its logic, that they might begin to question whether confidence was being mistaken for certainty. For an intelligence organization built on decisive interpretation, doubt was corrosive. As years passed, the report's existence faded from operational memory, but not from institutional consciousness. It remained classified, referenced obliquely, and avoided deliberately. New generations of analysts were unaware of it. Older ones remembered it as a quiet warning that had never been resolved. The United States kept the report secret for 30 years, not because it revealed Soviet insight, but because it revealed American vulnerability. As the report faded from daily discussion, its influence did not disappear. It lingered in the background of internal debates, shaping how certain analysts interpreted events even when the document itself was never mentioned. The CIA had effectively buried the report, but it could not erase the questions it raised. Over the years, several incidents reinforced its relevance. Periods of heightened alert triggered by ambiguous intelligence. Rapid consensus formed around worst-case scenarios. Internal dissent quietly sidelined in the name of decisiveness. Each time, senior analysts were reminded of the KGB's warning, even if they could not openly acknowledge it. This created an unusual tension within the organization. On the surface, analytical confidence remained strong. Official doctrine emphasized rigorous review, multiple checks, and structured debate. In practice, however, the pressure to deliver clear conclusions under political scrutiny often narrowed interpretation. The report had described this dynamic precisely. The CIA leadership faced a dilemma. Addressing the report openly would require admitting that a foreign intelligence service had correctly identified a systemic weakness. Ignoring it entirely risked repeating the very failures the report warned about. The compromise was silence combined with informal awareness. Certain internal reforms quietly reflected this influence. Analytical language became more cautious. Probability estimates were emphasized over definitive statements. Some review processes were adjusted to allow dissenting views more time. None of these changes were attributed to the KGB report, but their timing was not coincidental. The report itself remained inaccessible. Requests to review it were denied without explanation. References were removed from archival indexes. Even its title was avoided. It existed only as memory and implication. For younger analysts, the absence was invisible. They inherited a system that had already absorbed the lesson, without ever naming its source. For older analysts, the report became a symbol of institutional discomfort, a reminder that the most dangerous insights sometimes came from outside. Meanwhile, the KGB continued its own assessment. From the Soviet perspective, the report's effectiveness was measured not by reaction, but by restraint. The lack of public denial suggested recognition. The absence of counter-analysis suggested discomfort. Silence, once again, was confirmation. What made the situation remarkable was how little direct interaction occurred. There was no exchange of messages, no diplomatic reference, no intelligence confrontation. Two adversarial systems had entered a silent dialogue conducted entirely through interpretation and behavior. The CIA's fear was not that the report would leak. It was that acknowledging it internally would legitimize doubt. Intelligence organizations relied on confidence to function. Excessive doubt could paralyze decision-making. Yet insufficient doubt could accelerate error. The report exposed this balance without offering a solution. As the Cold War approached its final years, the urgency that had once dominated intelligence work began to ease. Political change introduced new uncertainties, but also new flexibility. In that environment, the report's warnings became less threatening and more instructive. Still, the document remained classified. The reason was no longer operational risk. It was narrative control. Declassifying the report would raise a simple but damaging question. If the CIA had known about these vulnerabilities for decades, why had they never been addressed publicly? Silence preserved institutional continuity. When the Cold War ended, many files were reviewed for declassification. The KGB report was not among them. It was deferred, then deferred again. Each delay reinforced its status as something best left untouched. By the time 30 years had passed, the report no longer posed a strategic threat. It posed a historical one. It challenged the story. Intelligence agencies told about themselves that failures were caused by lack of information, not by interpretation. The CIA had feared the report because it shifted responsibility inward. It suggested that danger did not always come from the enemy. Sometimes it came from believing too strongly in one's own conclusions. As time passed, the KGB report gradually transformed. From a perceived threat into an institutional ghost inside the CIA, it was no longer discussed, cited, or referenced, yet its presence shaped behavior indirectly. The organization adjusted without ever admitting why. Senior officials understood that the report's real danger was not operational. It did not compromise sources, methods, or ongoing missions. Its danger was psychological. It undermined the assumption that intelligence failure was always the result of missing information rather than flawed interpretation. Within internal circles, the report became a boundary. Certain questions were not encouraged. Certain comparisons were avoided. Analysts were taught to challenge assumptions, but not the system that validated those assumptions. The report blurred that line. The CIA leadership feared that formal acknowledgement of the document would create a precedent. If a foreign intelligence service could correctly diagnose internal weaknesses, then the myth of analytical superiority would fracture. That myth was essential not only for morale, but for authority. Intelligence agencies operated on trust from policymakers, from allies, and from their own analysts. To preserve that trust, silence was chosen again. The report remained classified beyond normal review cycles. Requests for declassification were deferred under broad justifications, incomplete context, ongoing relevance, potential misinterpretation. None of these explanations addressed the real reason. The document challenged the narrative of control. Ironically, many of the reforms the CIA later adopted echoed the report's conclusions. Emphasis on structured dissent, red teaming exercises, slower escalation protocols. These changes were presented as lessons learned from historical incidents, not from a KGB analysis. The source was erased, but the logic survived. From the Soviet side, the report required no follow-up. The KGB did not attempt to capitalize on it publicly. Doing so would have destroyed its value. Exposure would turn the analysis into propaganda. Silence preserved its credibility. As the Cold War ended, the report's relevance appeared to fade. New threats replaced old ones. Intelligence priorities shifted toward different regions and different technologies. The document became a relic of another era, yet it remained sealed. When discussions about transparency emerged in the post-Cold War period, the report resurfaced briefly. Some argued that it belonged to history and should be released. Others warned that declassification could undermine confidence in current systems by revealing how long concerns had been ignored. The decision was made quietly. The report would remain classified. By then, the reason was no longer fear of the KGB. It was fear of reflection. The document forced uncomfortable questions. How often had intelligence failures been the result of internal momentum, rather than enemy deception? How many near misses had occurred because assumptions hardened too quickly? Those questions had no clean answers. The report was not a verdict. It was a diagnosis, and diagnoses, once acknowledged, demand treatment. treatment requires change. Change threatens stability. For 30 years, the CIA kept the report secret not to hide Soviet insight, but to avoid confronting its own vulnerability. The silence surrounding the document became part of institutional memory, a EFE, reminder that some truths were more disruptive than classified information. As historians later discovered fragments of the report's existence, they found no scandal, no betrayal, no dramatic revelation. What they found was something quieter and more unsettling. A foreign intelligence service had understood the system well enough to see where it might fail, and the system had recognized that understanding as dangerous. When the report was finally reviewed for possible declassification decades later, its contents were no longer operationally sensitive. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Many of the individuals involved had retired or passed away, and yet the decision remained the same. The document stayed classified. The reason had nothing to do with the KGB. The report did not reveal Soviet capabilities or methods. It revealed something more enduring. It showed how intelligence systems could become prisoners of their own confidence. It demonstrated how interpretation, once reinforced by institutional pressure, could harden into certainty even when evidence was incomplete. By the time 30 years had passed, the CIA understood that releasing the report would not change history. It would change perception. It would invite a reassessment of how intelligence failures were explained, not as gaps in information, but as failures of judgment. For an organization built on authority and trust, that reassessment carried risk. The report was never feared because it criticized the United States. Intelligence agencies expected criticism from adversaries. It was feared because it described American behavior accurately, calmly and without hostility. It did not accuse. It observed. And observation was harder to dismiss than propaganda. The CIA's silence became the final acknowledgement. Internally, the lessons of the report had already been absorbed. Analytical reforms, caution in escalation, and structured dissent became standard practice over time. These changes were framed as evolution, not correction. The origin of the insight was intentionally forgotten. From the KGB's perspective, the report required no recognition. It had been written to understand, not to intimidate. Its effectiveness was measured by restraint, not reaction. The absence of a public response confirmed that it had struck its intended target. What stunned the United States was not that the KGB had analyzed it. That was expected. What stunned it was that the analysis had been correct enough to matter. The report forced American intelligence to confront a difficult truth. The greatest threat was not always the enemy's deception. Sometimes it was the system's own momentum, the pressure to decide quickly, to appear decisive, to trust consensus over doubt. That truth did not belong to the Cold War alone. It applied to every intelligence system operating under uncertainty and time pressure. It applied wherever fear accelerated. Interpretation faster than evidence could restrain it. In the end, the report was not suppressed because it was dangerous to reveal. It was suppressed because it was difficult to answer. There was no rebuttal that did not require self-examination. There was no declassification that did not invite uncomfortable reflection. So the document remained sealed, not to protect secrets, but to protect certainty. And that was why the CIA feared the KGB's report. Not because it exposed weakness, but because it showed how easily strength could become vulnerability.